first of all, I'd like to thank Westminster College and the president for hosting us, and the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy for inviting me here. It's such a pleasure to be here in Utah and to be away from Washington, D.C., back to the West. I'm originally from Nevada. My husband was born here in Salt Lake City. And when I lived in Las Vegas for many years, I was very happy to get out of the heat and mosey on over to Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon and spend time with my brother, who at the time lived first in St. George and then in Cedar City. So it's been many, many years, and I was in Salt Lake City in 1995, just a few years ago. And it's grown so much. I couldn't believe how much it's grown. It's just a beautiful city, and especially the snow. I don't know if all of you are happy about the snow. Yeah. But I was very happy to see the snow. As mentioned, I work for the United States Institute of Peace. USIP is based in Washington, D.C., and it was established by Congress in 1984, and it was established with the premise that peace is possible. And the work that we do is based overseas in conflict-affected societies, and our job is to provide resources, tools, and assistance to countries struggling to break the cycles of violent conflict and find ways to rebuild after and to prevent the cycle from starting again. And I've had the privilege of working in many countries, as was described. When I'm not working and traveling in war-torn countries, I love to spend time with my family and camping and working in the garden, which is a great way to kind of connect with the earth and get grounded again after some of the work that we do. And I love spending time with my 14-year-old son, and it's because of him that I know how important it is for world peace and to prevent violent conflict, so that children like him around the world can grow up in safer, just, and secure environments. A lot of times people ask me how I got interested in the topic of fighting serious crimes. And definitely my family asks that every time I get on a plane. Couldn't you do just something different, like work at a garden store or be a farmer, considering how much you like planting things? But the reason I got involved in it is I don't know how much you remember of the situation in Kosovo, where NATO intervened when the Kosovo Albanians at the time, there was a form of genocide that was taking place, and over 50% of the majority of Kosovo Albanians had fled Kosovo, became internally displaced individuals within the province as well as over into neighboring areas like Albania. And after NATO's intervention into that conflict, the Serbian authorities who were running the province had fled. And when they fled at the time, there were really no justice system officials, no courts running, no police, because the Serb authorities were the ones that were running them at the time. And they had pushed out the Kosovo Albanians who had been running it years before. So the United Nations, as well as NATO at the time, stepped into that vacuum to try to help set up a justice and security system and support the rebuilding of their system. And the U.S. at the time stepped in and sent people, including me, to Kosovo. At the time, I was with the Justice Department in Washington, working as a trial attorney. And my background before that was a federal prosecutor in Las Vegas, Nevada. So I was sent to work on it from that angle. And when I got there, I was surprised, as was many of my colleagues, that we were not prepared for what we came across. We were not prepared for a number of reasons. First, to enter into what was a security vacuum. And even though there had been, as I mentioned, judges and prosecutors and police, there was no one on the streets when we arrived. And you can slowly see that what happens at the end of a conflict, whether it's a peace agreement or even in this situation where an international intervention occurs, that there is a security vacuum that gets filled very quickly. And it gets filled very quickly by a number of different sources. And what we were facing when we arrived is we were facing retaliatory kidnappings and murders of Kosovo Albanians against other Kosovo Albanians who were accused of collaborating or supporting the Serb authorities before. It included Serbian forces that were sowing discontent and violence on one of the neighboring villages in order to keep things a little bit unstable. And it also included political violence. And when I was there, I recall one morning a very large explosion taking place, rattling our windows, throwing me out of bed. I would like to say that I knew what to do and I landed on the floor, but I just kind of naturally landed on the floor. And it took a little while to figure out what was going on. And we learned quickly that it was a bomb that had been set off at a Serbian organization by one of the underground organizations that was run by the Kosovo Albanians. So these political violence and kidnappings and things were happening at such a pace, and we, as I mentioned, were completely ill-prepared for that. So after about a year and a half of working in that environment and doing the best we could and constantly playing catch-up at the time, a lot of us, when we left, it was right after 9/11, we left and came back to Washington, D.C., and some of my colleagues from the military, some from human rights NGOs, some like me from the Justice Department or non-government organizations, we got together and decided to put together what we could as far as lessons learned. What were the things that we did correctly? What were the things that we did not do correctly? What advice can we give to people like us who are going overseas to work in these environments? And even more importantly, what could we give as a resource to folks like the Kosovo Albanians and others that we worked with who were struggling with putting back together their country after a conflict? And so that was what motivated me, and we put together the first book called Fighting Serious Crimes. And I would like to say that over the past 10 years, everything has improved, and that there wasn't a need for such a book again. But I think as we're seeing around the world, that just isn't the case. And even when I look at the work that we've been doing, before there would be periods of time where when I was working in Afghanistan, there would be a time break in between, and then maybe we would go and I did some work in Iraq. But things were coming so quickly, especially over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We were being deployed on multiple different fronts because of the many different changes around the world. And so some colleagues of mine and I got together again, and at the request of a number of our colleagues in different countries who found the first book useful, they wanted to have a second book. And they wanted the book to have more case studies, more lessons learned, because a lot of the lessons had come from the Balkans, had come from the period of time with Kosovo. They wanted to learn more about what had come up through Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, all the new conflicts. So we agreed to put together that book, and that's the one that is out in the back there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about. So a lot of times people ask me, what do you mean by serious crimes? Because certainly serious crimes to victims or to a community and the human toll that they take is serious. But what we talk about in serious crimes in the book and in the work that I do is a special type of crime. It's a crime that can destabilize a peace agreement. It's a crime that can unwind whatever fragile peace may have been built in a specific country. And so really when we talk about serious crimes, we're talking about crimes and their impact. The impact being the destruction of a peace process, the resurgence of war. And the type of crime can be various depending upon the country. So in Kosovo, it was significantly more ethnic violence, ethnic and political violence. And other countries, like in Guatemala, it's the struggle that they're having with the corruption and the government that has been captured by organized criminal forces, where you couldn't really see daylight in between the government and the organized crime type of gangs. And other countries, it might be violent extremism. And many times it's a combination. And so when we talk about serious crimes, we're looking at those crimes, as I mentioned, that are going to impact the peace process and spark a resurgence of war. And one of the most important things to remember is that serious crimes, and as I mentioned a little bit about Kosovo, and security vacuums are very, very, very common. And I think in just about every country in which I've worked, one hopes that once there's a peace agreement or the war ends, that peace breaks out. But it doesn't, because there are many factions and factors. There are winners and there are losers. And in many situations, the peace agreement or the fragile peace that's built is not something that either criminal organizations, because they make money, drug running, weapons running, so the peace doesn't benefit them, or it's a faction. When I worked in Nepal, there was a group, and a splinter group, that was not happy with the peace agreement. They didn't feel like they were part of it, so they started to engage in political violence. So it's usually a very, I almost say there's like this calm before the storm. Even after Iraq, it was very safe in the very beginning to kind of be driving around. When I was in Libya, there was a period of time, like right after, there's this kind of calm. And then eventually the security vacuum is not filled by those who are following the justice, security, rule of law. It will be filled by those who profit and have a better chance of whatever they want to accomplish without having a peace vacuum, a security vacuum filled. So the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about are just a couple of trends that we were starting to see. And why, as I mentioned, we felt it was so important to focus on the new book and to be able to get that to our colleagues that are dealing with this overseas. And the challenges that we're seeing are a couple of dangerous trends that have been growing and more pronounced across affected countries. One, serious crimes are becoming more transnational, with the webs of criminal activity that spread from country to country and then engage entire regions. Also, the links between serious crimes, terrorists, and other violent extremists are growing stronger, so the consequences are becoming more extreme also. And also technology and the free flow of goods and individuals, especially that combined with the technology, make things very difficult in order to get a hold of it. And we know that many conflict societies are subject to these trends, are also struggling with a lot of the drivers of conflict to begin with. And this could be political, social, and economic challenges, including ethnic and sectarian violence and even full-scale civil war. So they're dealing with so many things all at the same time. And then when you look at conflict-affected societies, obviously law and order is broken down. Law enforcement may be weak, it may be non-existent, and in that case, serious crimes certainly proliferate. And the criminals aren't afraid of being arrested or convicted. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes we find that the government forces may be in cahoots with the criminal gangs. And when that happens, people and the society become less trusting of their government, less trusting of their police force. They don't go to the police force to get help. They go to either parallel organizations, being from Las Vegas, Nevada, years ago with the mafia as being its own enforcement mechanism. We see that in many different countries where certain communities don't trust the government forces, so they use their own vigilante or mafia type groups, and they have their own form of law enforcement. And then at the end of the day, when you look at this, there are really two different groups that can have an impact on whether a security vacuum is filled or whether it's not. And I'm going to talk about both of those groups. One is the government, institutions, and organizations, and the other are individuals and individual communities. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what can governments and institutions, policymakers and practitioners who work for them do. The first thing that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show a short video, is really for that government, its police force, its policymakers, parliament, to really understand and deeply hold the importance of the concept of rule of law. And we hear that term a lot, the rule of law. And so I'm going to show just a little short video of what we mean when we talk about the importance of rule of law and the importance of the government itself embracing the principles of rule of law.
Rule of law, it means we're all equal in front of the law.
When everybody is free to say what they want, justice.
The rule of law is holding people accountable to the law. The law must emanate from the people. Look, the law lives in the consciousness of the people. If you don't have that, you don't have it.
In countries where the rule of law is absent, ordinary people do not have access to the justice system. Imagine you're walking down the street and you're suddenly approached by plainclothes police officers from a secret security agency. You're taken to a prison, you're tortured, you're abused, you're held without any legal grounds, and you have just simply disappeared.
The rule of law emanates from the people of a nation. Yet there are countries where the rule of law is not a common practice.
Without the rule of law, you have a nation where its citizens' fundamental rights and well-being are not protected.
The United States Institute of Peace believes that rule of law is the lifeblood of a society.
One example of how we bring in voices of the people into the process is through justice and security dialogue, where we bring citizens, government, police, and others together to build trust, identify the rule of law challenges, and come up together with joint solutions and strategies.
The rule of law is more than about one person, or even groups of people. The rule of law is a process, but once constructed, can be enduring.
What we're seeing in the world is people's demand for a voice in decisions that affect their lives. For a society that provides justice, security, and accountability for everyone. In other words, a society that abides by the rule of law.
So to summarize in the video, what we talk about is the rule of law, in short, means that everyone, no matter what their position is accountable and subject to the law. And the law itself is a system of rules that govern our behavior within society, and these rules promote social order by providing a mechanism with which people in society can peacefully resolve their disputes. And so one of the key things that institutions and organizations and all of the people that work in those organizations can do is to abide by the rule of law and foster a culture of rule of law. And a really important component of that, a lot of times people may think about rule of law as a technical thing, that it's just a law, it's in a bunch of books in a law library, and that judges in robes are the ones that make decisions on that law. But the reality of it is, in so many of the countries in which we work, if that were enough, then we would have rule of law everywhere. In Afghanistan, the very first thing we did when we arrived is we realized that a lot of the books had been burned by the Taliban. And so we worked with their legal scholars to pull together all the books that we could find, including a number that had been taken by legal scholars and brought to the US and Europe. And we put them together and provided them to the judicial system. But that didn't mean that then rule of law, just because people read it, was going to be adhered to. And as the Justice mentioned, the critical factor of rule of law is that it be part of somebody's personality, it's part of somebody's whole approach, and that it's adopted not as a thing, but as a culture. And so that's the biggest challenge, is many of the countries in which we work, there's been no culture or modeling of what that looks like. And so it's very difficult to do something when that has never been done in the culture and in the space in which you've been growing up. The next thing besides abiding by the rule of law, do I need to, Tina's making sure I'm not messing up the electronics. One of the things is absolutely critical that before we go in or before anybody in their own country tries to make a change, is that effectively they know what is driving the problems. And so careful studies, careful assessments are absolutely imperative. And I think many times in the work that we do, in the zeal to make a difference, a lot of folks in the international community go in and take things that may work in one or make work at home, and then impose that or suggest that this is something that will work in a specific country. When in reality, even within a country, even regionally, what may work in one place may not work in another. So it's so important to take a step back, to understand what's going on, to look at what's driving the conflict, driving the serious crimes, and then tailoring the responses. And most importantly, to listen to the people in that community, in that country, in that region, to provide guidance on what kind of help is needed. And then the second part is to really understand, as I mentioned, it's not just technical, like passing laws, but what's driving a lot of the turbulence or the chaos in the countries we're working on is not just the justice system not succeeding. It's really deeper than that. And it's deeper on a number of levels. One, it's driven by the political, social, and economic factors, some of it all intertwined. And also, it could be in a number of the countries in which we've worked, there's deepening social divisions that are between social groups that have lived together peacefully, but now start to fear for their own survival, that they're going to be killed or affected in some negative way by another group. You see unscrupulous political actors are using the politics of hate and division as a way of winning elections and holding on to power. We saw this in Kosovo with the Serbian leaders using the ethnic card to sow divisions amongst the Kosovar Serbs and Albanians who actually had lived together very peacefully. And soon through that fear, using fear, you started to have neighbor turning upon neighbor. Also, there's the rising anger and intolerance that happens also, some of these very human things that happen. And we saw this with Buddhist gangs when I was in Burma, that before some of the political actors were using nationalism and using fear against their Muslim minority to stir up some of the Buddhist communities, and you started to see Buddhist communities torching some of the Muslim villages. Again, these were things that were being used for political purposes, stoking fear. Another dynamic may involve the individual, the community, and a larger sense of trauma and chronic stress. And I think when I first started to work in overseas, coming at it from being a lawyer, and I looked at it through the lens of everything, as a lawyer, everything could be fixed by passing a law or doing something like that. And it became very clear, as I mentioned, there are other things going on. But what has really hit home is how much, when there's a war and societies and families have been torn apart, especially if you're in a community where fear and other things have been stoked, like I mentioned in Kosovo. The challenge with that is it starts to affect the neurobiology of the individuals there. And when I was in Libya, right after Muammar Gaddafi, where he was captured and then killed after a revolution, I was going into Benghazi, and we were working with the lawyers there and talking about what could be done to help prevent a security vacuum that was going to happen. And a lot of the people that were put in these positions of authority, like the Minister of Justice and others, had been citizens who had been fighting the revolution. And so a lot of the international community was frustrated because they weren't able to get some of these folks to move quickly enough. But the reality is we started to work with some of the psychiatrists and psychologists, and what they were seeing is a whole level of community trauma, because a lot of these folks, none of them had been professionally trained as soldiers. They were just, most of them were students, engineers, a lot of engineers, lawyers, who took up arms to fight against the Gaddafi forces. And so they were not prepared mentally or physically for this. So when they came out, there was a period of time there where alcoholism, in a country where alcohol is banned, there was alcoholism, drug abuse, and it was a struggle to be able to get things put together when people were dealing with that. So starting to look at the neurobiology of fear and trauma and conflict and how it's difficult to break through that without appropriate support. Then the other types of things could be, as I mentioned, technical things like police reform. I've already mentioned passing laws, prison reform. In Libya, what was interesting is some of the best prison reformists were actually former prisoners who had been under the Gaddafi regime. And they had suffered from a lot of human rights abuses and torture. And so a lot of them actually, unlike what you would think would be a cycle of violence, they stepped up and they were starting to engage in reforms in order to improve the treatment of prisoners. And then the other thing, which actually the rule of law video mentioned, it's working with communities. One of the biggest things that happens in conflict, especially if we have an authoritarian regime or abusive police forces, is the complete lack of trust naturally between the community and the police or the government. If people are always seeing the police as predators at best, then that's obviously a struggle when there's a security vacuum. And so working with community and local populations to bring them into the reform process is crucial. And when I was working in Nepal in the very beginning, right after their civil war had ended and there was an insurgency with the Maoist insurgents, there was a huge division between the police and the human rights activists because the police had been either non-existent and they felt victimized by the Maoists, or when they were there, they just saw them as beating them during a lot of their protests. And so over time, though, both of them started to see that if they didn't start working together in their communities, then they were not going to be able to have security for any of their families. And so you started to see them working together over time. Then there's also the question next, as I talked about what institutions can do, but then what are things that ordinary citizens can do, and what have ordinary citizens done in a lot of the countries in which I've worked. And this is the part that's very exciting to me, because I've seen how much one individual or a group of individuals working together, what a difference that can make. It's almost like starting a little spark and how it can spread out. And we've seen that many, many times. And there are many opportunities for average citizens to step in and build peace, especially where the social fabric has been ripped apart. Any little bit of knitting together or pulling threads together can be very, very powerful. So there are four things that I wanted to highlight. One is that groups who have stepped up to understand other groups. And that's where individuals can serve as peace builders by engaging and seeking to understand the other groups, to understand what are their fears, what are their concerns, and rather than the immediate reaction of fighting back because of the differences of opinions, stopping to really listen and to try to make a difference with that other group. And the other type of thing is a peace builder can understand why the other group is using violence. Not that it's condoning the violence, but to understand why is this happening? What is driving the violence? Why is the other group feeling like the only way that they can make a change? In Nepal, it was anytime they wanted to make a change, it had to be violent conflict in the streets, protests, burning tires. And so the police started to try to understand why were they doing that? What was driving that? Not that that wasn't illegal and they weren't going to have to deal with it, but they tried to figure out why and then to try to get to the root drivers of that and then work together to find a solution. Another example comes from northern Iraq. A colleague of mine was working there, and he worked with a family whose son had been brutally stabbed and beaten by a large group from another religion. Their son was from a minority religion, and the majority members of that community had beaten and stabbed him. And the normal thing that would happen there is it would have been sparked a cycle of violence. Then the one group would have been come back at the other group. And so the first thing that happened is the tribal council decreed that money be paid as compensation. That was the goal, to try to stop the cycle. But the family knew that that wasn't going to stop it. So the family of the victimized son actually made the decision to forfeit the financial compensation. And then they also decided to give forgiveness to that group. And then that sparked a broader peace. Even though it was a very difficult thing to do, at that point there was no more violence in the community. And a second way that I mentioned is to help groups come together to explore differences. Fear, discrimination, anger, and trauma all contribute to division within individuals and groups at different levels. And that happens in the community and even national. So often what we might see is to help build bridges, neutral mediators for the community, those who were respected, and it comes from all different groups. It could be a tribal leader, it could be a religious leader, it could be a professor in one area. It's whoever is respected and trusted as a neutral mediator can bring groups together in safe spaces to just listen and to kind of provide that time. And the goal in the situation immediately is not to try to change minds, because the minute folks are in there trying to change minds, and that doesn't get to where they need to go. And an example of that is in Nepal, where after the signing of a peace agreement that ended their civil war, as I mentioned, the community and the police were really at great odds and strained, and I mentioned to you the dialogue that they went through. And at first, I remember the very first meeting we had, we were sitting in this large room, and the police were all lined up on one side, and the community, mainly human rights activists, were lined up on the other side. And there was so much tension in the room because both sides felt victimized. The police felt victimized because they felt that the government was not providing support. They felt that the protesters had been throwing works at them. They had been injured. The human rights activists felt that they were being victimized because the police would be hitting them over the heads with these sticks. And so there's just a lot of emotion in the room. And when it was getting to this stage, because they were trying to listen, two of the senior police officials and one of the professors stepped in and then just brought the group together to just allow some space and then to allow each group to talk. And over a period of hours, it took a long time, over a period of hours, it got them to a place that over time now, after a period of 8 years, through a long process of listening from that very tense first day, that what has happened is the security forces and local communities have met in more than 500 dialogues and discovered that their mutual trust was often rooted in either misunderstanding, misinformation, or through things that were outside their control. And when there were things that were inside their control, for example, an abusive police officer or corruption within a human rights organization, they dealt with those one-on-one instead of generalizing against the larger groups. And according to the police, cooperation and communication with the youth in just one district led to an 80% reduction in the number of violent demonstrations. So a lot of times people think that talking and dialoguing is weak in a way to resolve serious crimes, but actually when you talk to the police and the citizens in those communities, it's actually one of the hardest things to do, and the process that can be very successful. So one of the final ways is really for people to step in, to take action, and it's difficult for one person alone often, but it's also amazing, as I mentioned before, how one thing can actually, one very simple thing can make such a big difference. And I want to just explain an example. This one is from Libya again. I was in Libya, and we were doing interviews for a book called Speaking Their Peace. And what we were trying to do is do interviews with people in over 100 people in 7 different countries, and asking very basic questions. What does rule of law mean to you? What do you want the international community to know? What works? What doesn't work? And it was the idea of actually asking people who are often subjected to outside assistance to ask them what would be useful, so that then those who want to provide outside assistance actually can be better informed. So those of us who are doing the work, instead of going in assuming what we think is right, is asking people what will work. And so when I was in Libya, I met with a woman named Salwa. And Salwa had been working in a museum. And the museum was an old Italian, when Libya was a colony from Italy. It's this beautiful museum. And she invited us to go in because it had been turned into a memory building. And a memory building, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the civilians that were killed during the revolution in Libya were students and civilians, professionals, teachers, engineers. Mostly they were young people. And so what they wanted to do was to honor the young people. And so they lined up all their photos on the walls. There's just pages and pages and pages just on the walls everywhere that you could see. And then I looked over, and I could see on one half was the Memory Museum, and on the other side were all of these interesting statues. And I started to look closer, and I could tell that a lot of the statues were made out of weapons. One part was from a 50 caliber weapon, and I could see the bullets, and so I was very curious about this. And so Salwa said that the gentleman that you're seeing right there, he was a welder. And what he had done during the revolution is he was making homemade improvised weapons for the revolutionaries during the night under the cover of darkness, so that the Gaddafi forces would locate him. But during the day, just to get some peace of mind because of what they were struggling with and what his role in it was, he started to just make sculptures. So people would bring to him all of the broken machinery and the weapons that had been used during the war, and then he would weld them together. And it was just everywhere. There was so much. He was so prolific. And everything, and they were whimsical. There was, he made a Don Quixote and a donkey that he had given to me. And so what Salwa talked about is how she felt like she wanted to do something, but she didn't know what to do. So she found this old military Jeep that had been discarded, and she just painted it pink with flowers. And she just put it out there on the street. And that may not sound like a very profound thing, but it's actually deeply profound, in that the children who were struggling and hearing bombs during the day, they could walk by when things were calm, and they could smile, and people could just smile. And so something as simple as this may not build peace immediately, but at the same time, it's just one little spark. And so something very simple that she was able to do. And also how the aspect of art has a lot of meaning too. And so Salwa talks a little bit about the meaning of the sculptures.
It's burned, it's cracked, it's broken, but I want to use it to make a piece of art. It's very important. It's a full message to wounded, the people that lost their members, and many of them, they got depressed because they're very young and they lost like their leg or their... So I just wanted to give them the message that even if you are broken, you're not made, like your life is not over, like your life continues and you can be a part of the country, of the this is the message he wants to. That's why he loves the broken things, like, because we all have this, like, these failures and this scars inside, but it doesn't mean that we have this scars. We have the people we have to thwart. Like, we are here and we are a part of this life. This burden.
So it was so interesting because as Saul has said, it was also when she talked to the welder and the work that she started to do with them, they found a deeper message. And then they had so many of the fighters that would come in and just spend time with the welder. And she started to understand why this form of art was so powerful and healing for a lot of the former fighters. And as she said, because it conveyed a message to them that even if you are broken, your life is not over. Your life continues. That is why he, the welder, loves the broken things, because we all have these failures and these scars inside. So it's just one of those things that, as I mentioned, things that are very important to combat serious crimes, the laws, the police action, understanding the drivers, those are absolutely critical. And at the same time, equally as critical is the role that individuals can play in their community in building bridges and bringing light and hope to people in the community. So she said that the energy I get when you receive positive energy from people, it reveals you and you have the feeling to do something important. And the police officers that I worked with, so many of them said they started to see a change when they started treating people with respect and kindness. They started to see improvements even in the crime rates that were going on. So everybody, whether you're a police officer or an artist, the things that people can do just by their actions every day. So in conclusion, I truly believe, from what I've witnessed in so many countries, despite the challenges and the destruction and the pain that so many people have gone through, at the exact same time, I see so many pink cars, so to speak. And I see how much power the individual has in whatever role they are, whether they're a police officer, whether they're an artist, whether they're a student. And that each person can be transformative in large ways and in small ways. And in doing so, it helps strengthen the social fabric that I've talked about so that it can be resilient and can resist pressures that pull it apart. Thank you.